Jeffrey Dahmer was born in Milwaukee, Wisconsin on May 21, 1960. To the outside world, his family seemed quite normal, living a typical suburban life in the American Midwest. His father, Lionel, was a research chemist, and his mother, Joyce, was a teletype machine instructor. However, beneath this surface of normalcy, there were deep-seated tensions. Joyce struggled with her mental health, experiencing long bouts of depression and anxiety, which often created a strained and volatile atmosphere within the home. This environment left a young Jeffrey feeling isolated and neglected, searching for stability in a household that offered very little of it. As a child, Jeffrey was described as energetic and happy, but this changed significantly during his early school years. He became withdrawn, quiet, and increasingly disconnected from his peers. He developed an unusual fascination with animal bones, a hobby that started with finding dead animals on the side of the road. He would collect these remains, dissect them in a small hut behind his family's home in Bath, Ohio, and experiment with dissolving the flesh in acid to preserve the skeletons. This macabre interest was an early and disturbing sign of the obsessions that would later define his horrific crimes against human beings. His teenage years were marked by even greater social isolation and a growing dependence on alcohol. He started drinking heavily in high school, often showing up to class intoxicated or carrying a bottle in his briefcase. This behavior was a desperate attempt to cope with his internal turmoil, including his confusion and shame about his emerging homosexuality and his increasingly violent fantasies. He struggled to form meaningful connections with others, feeling like an outsider looking in. The loneliness he experienced only fueled his retreat into a dark, private world, where he felt he could exert some form of control. The divorce of his parents in 1978 served as a major tipping point in his life. Just weeks after graduating from high school, he was left completely alone in the family home, when his father moved into a motel, and his mother took his younger brother David to live in another state. It was during this period of profound abandonment, at the age of just 18, that Jeffrey Dahmer committed his first murder. The act seemed to be a desperate, twisted attempt to prevent someone from leaving him, a theme that would tragically and violently repeat itself throughout the next 13 years of his life. The first person to lose their life to Jeffrey Dahmer was Stephen Hicks, a young hitchhiker Dahmer picked up in June 1978. Hicks was only 18 years old and was on his way to a rock concert. Dahmer invited him back to his family's home for some drinks, promising him a ride later. His motive was simple and chilling. He didn't want Hicks to leave. When Hicks insisted on going, Dahmer struck him from behind with a barbell, killing him. He then dismembered the body and buried the remains in the woods behind his house, establishing a gruesome pattern of control and possession that would characterize all his future crimes. After his first murder, Dahmer's life spiraled further out of control. He briefly attended Ohio State University, but dropped out due to his alcoholism. His father then enlisted him in the army, hoping the structure would help him. However, his drinking problems persisted, and he was discharged. He eventually moved to West Allis, Wisconsin, to live with his grandmother, Catherine Dahmer. It was during this time, from 1982 to 1988, that his killings resumed. He preyed on young men he met at gay bars, luring them back to his grandmother's house with promises of money or drinks. He would drug their beverages with sleeping pills and then strangle them. One of his victims during this period was Stephen Twomey, a 24-year-old man he met at a bar in 1987. Dahmer claimed he had no memory of killing Twomey, stating he woke up next to the man's lifeless body in a hotel room. This supposed blackout did not stop him. He purchased a large suitcase to transport the body back to his grandmother's basement. Other victims from this time included Jamie Doxtator, a 14-year-old boy, and Richard Guerrero, a 25-year-old man. Each victim represented a failed attempt by Dahmer to create a compliant, zombie-like partner who would never abandon him, a fantasy he pursued with increasing desperation. His grandmother, though initially tolerant of his behavior, eventually grew tired of the strange men he brought home and the foul odors coming from the basement and garage. In 1988, she asked him to move out. This forced relocation marked a new, more prolific phase in his killing spree. He moved into the Oxford Apartments, located at 924 North 25th Street in a predominantly black neighborhood in Milwaukee. Here, with no one to monitor his activities, Dahmer was free to indulge his darkest impulses without restraint, turning his small apartment into a personal abattoir and laboratory for his grotesque experiments. At the Oxford Apartments, Jeffrey Dahmer's reign of terror reached its terrifying peak. Between 1988 and his capture in 1991, he murdered 12 more men and boys. His method was chillingly consistent. He would target young men, many of whom were men of color, from gay bars, bus stops, or shopping malls. He used his non-threatening appearance to gain their trust, offering them money to pose for photographs, or simply to come back to his apartment for a drink. Once they were inside his apartment, number 213, their fate was sealed. He would drug them, and once they were unconscious, he would kill them, usually by strangulation. The victims who tragically entered apartment 213 came from various backgrounds, but they all shared a vulnerability that Dahmer exploited. They included Anthony Sears, 26, whose head and heart Dahmer kept. Another was Raymond Smith, 33, who was also known as Ricky Beeks. There was Edward Smith, 28, and Ernest Miller, 22, who had met Dahmer just before he was killed. There was also David Thomas, 23. Each of these men was looking for a connection, a friend, or perhaps just a ride home, only to cross paths with a predator who saw them not as people, but as objects for his twisted desires. The list of victims from this period is a heartbreaking testament to the lives he destroyed. Matt Turner, 20, was another young man who lost his life. Jeremiah Weinberger, 23, was murdered after Dahmer drilled a hole into his skull in a horrifying attempt to create a living zombie. Oliver Lacey, 23, and Joseph Braidhoft, 25, were also among those killed in the apartment. Perhaps most tragically, there was Konorak Synthesomphone, a 14-year-old boy who managed to escape, naked and bleeding, only to be returned to Dahmer by police who dismissed the incident as a domestic dispute between adults. He was killed shortly after their departure. Dahmer's apartment was a house of horrors where he acted out his ultimate fantasies of domination. He dismembered his victims' bodies in his bathtub, keeping their skulls and other body parts as trophies. He took photographs to document every stage of the gruesome process, preserving his memories of the men he killed. He even experimented with cannibalism and necrophilia, driven by a desperate and pathological need to possess his victims completely, to ensure they could never leave him. The apartment was filled with the tools of his trade: a large blue drum filled with acid, saws, knives, and a refrigerator containing human heads. The end of Jeffrey Dahmer's killing spree came on the night of July 22, 1991. A 32-year-old man named Tracy Edwards managed to do what so many others could not. He escaped. Dahmer had lured Edwards back to his apartment where he handcuffed one of his wrists and threatened him with a large knife. After a terrifying struggle, Edwards saw an opportunity and punched Dahmer, allowing him to flee into the street with the handcuffs still dangling from his wrist. He flagged down a police car and, in a state of panic, led two officers, Robert Routh and Rolf Muller, back to apartment 213. When the officers entered the apartment, they were immediately struck by a putrid smell. As one officer checked the bedroom, he opened a nightstand drawer and discovered a collection of Polaroid photographs depicting dismembered human bodies in various gruesome poses. The horrific reality of what was happening in that apartment became instantly clear. Dahmer was arrested on the spot. A subsequent search of the apartment uncovered an unspeakable scene: severed heads in the refrigerator, skulls in a closet, and a 57-gallon drum containing several torsos dissolving in acid. The full, horrifying extent of his crimes was finally exposed to the world. The discovery sent shockwaves through Milwaukee and the entire nation. The community was horrified and outraged, not only by the brutality of the crimes, but also by the perceived failures of the police. The story of 14-year-old Konorak Synthesomphone, who had been returned to Dahmer by officers just 2 months earlier, sparked immense public anger. It highlighted systemic issues of racism and homophobia within the police force, as many believed the officers did not take the situation seriously because the victims were gay men and people of color. Protests erupted, demanding accountability and justice for the victims and their grieving families. In 1992, Jeffrey Dahmer was put on trial. He pleaded guilty, but insane. The jury, however, rejected his insanity defense, finding him legally sane at the time of the murders. He was convicted of 15 murders in Wisconsin and later sentenced for a 16th murder in Ohio. He received 16 life sentences, ensuring he would never be free again. On November 28, 1994, Dahmer's life came to a violent end when he was beaten to death by a fellow inmate at the Columbia Correctional Institution. His story remains a chilling reminder of the depths of human depravity and serves as a cautionary tale about the importance of listening to and protecting the most vulnerable members of society.